Page 94, the Private Eye Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Page 94. My name is Andrew Hunter-Murray and I'm here in the Private Eye offices with Adam McQueen and Helen Lewis. This is a non-emergency podcast, let's be honest.
It's a banal podcast.
It's completely in the normal schedule.
Utterly standard.
Yeah, there's nothing to see here. Move along. But it is about politics, and so we have to use the word emergency at some point, apparently. So, as it's election season, we're going to have some audience questions in a moment. But firstly, Helen and Adam, as Private Eye hacks, which are the bits of the election that you've been following that you think have not received enough attention? There's been loads and loads on D-Day and tax claims back and forth. What are the bits of the campaign so far that you think haven't received enough attention, or any sort of fun moments that kind of got lost in the stampede?
I am going to nominate the Conservative chairman, Richard Holden, getting parachuted from his seat in Durham to Billericay in Essex. You know, there's phenomenon of the chicken run. There was a lot of talk during the Boris Johnson era of how he was going to do a chicken run to a more safe seat.
The chicken run is where you have a seat that you're going to lose, and then you just...
And you find a much more safe one. And and the association basically is whatever blandishment is offered.
There was a lot of it went on before the 97 election. That was the last big chicken run. People like, I think Brian Mawhinney, who was the Conservative Party chairman, again, exactly the same thing, did a chicken run to some sort of safer seat.
And Douglas Ross has done it in Scotland. So the current, soon to be former leader of the Scottish Conservatives, has moved into a seat that the current incumbent of it is a Conservative who's in the middle of having some spinal problems, had hoped to have it, and then was told that no, he would not in fact be running for this seat. It was in fact going to Douglas
He was
Ross.
In fact too unwell. He was feeling better, but actually no, he was wrong about that.
You might think you're going to be offered a seat. Well, you're going to have to move aside.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so Richard Holden is in a similar situation in which he said, I love the Northwest, it's in my blood. And it turns out what else is also in his blood is Essex, and he also loves Essex and has done since last Thursday, basically.
Adam, what about you?
I'm going to go with Ed Davey, just the very concept of Ed Davey, because we're all talking about Ed Davey's crazy photo opportunities and Ed Davey having fun, but we're all talking about Ed Davey, and I bet you not many people knew who Ed Davey was about 3 weeks ago, and he's very much there, sort of front and centre. But he's also combined that with, he did a party political broadcast, and he did a couple of interviews as well, talking about the need for reforms to the care system, but specifically with reference to his own learning disabled son. And I think that sort of personal thing, you have to be careful not to, it's a very cynical journalistic view, but you have to be careful not to overdo that sort of thing in elections. But I think personal stuff does cut through when everyone seems very much like a kind of machine politician in the same sort of grey suit. And I think I'm predicting great things for the Lib Dems in this election. I think they're going to be the bit that people aren't quite focusing on, but I think they're going to do very well, certainly by Lib Dem standards. Since the backlash against Cleggmania, which was so spectacular.
They will soon be able to fill a battle bus. Exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this time on page 94, we have asked you, the readers and the listeners of the magazine and podcast, respectively, what you would like to know about the election. We've had plenty in. Some cheerful, some gloomy. But we'll try and cheer everyone up and, spread the joy in this
How many
episode.
of them were nice about you, Andy?
One. Oh, no. Actually, I cut that one out of the list. So on my list, none. But there was one that was very nice about all of us in general, from Jason Borthwick. Love the Page 94 podcast. So much less up its own arse than competition.
That's exactly what we're going for.
Well, there is no competition.
That is squatting over a low bar.
No, but very cheerfully, he says, I've been an occasional reader for decades, usually buying from newsagents at train stations, to make it sound very seedy, but now a subscriber again, which is exactly what we've spent 9 years making this podcast trying to do. So it's worked.
Jason Borthwick has my vote.
Well, his question is, if Labour get more seats than the Tories, is Starmer guaranteed to be PM, even if Labour doesn't get a Commons majority?
And the answer to that is no. The convention has been if whoever's got the largest party gets first crack at forming a government. But the test of that is really whether or not you can get budget through. That's why it's called a confidence and supply. You have to be able to either win a vote of confidence or get supply measures, which are budget financial measures. So you don't necessarily, if you're the largest party, get to automatically be Prime Minister, because you might not be able to get anything through, at which point 1974, things all collapse and fall apart.
You get an election and Labour get in with a minority and they just about manage to scramble through a few months. And very similarly, at that point, there was no money left either. But then another election later on in the year, so we might get a November election after all. Get a second one.
So
That'll be fantastic.
I don't know what polls you're looking at, what crack you're smoking. Seems unlikely.
But how do you know if you're able to get a budget through at the time when you're doing all the horse trading You like in 2010, where the Conservatives were the largest party, but they didn't have an outright majority.
That's
What's
what I mean. The convention is that it has
Yeah.
been the person with the largest gets first go at having a go at getting something through.
And
Right.
forming a coalition, as with the Lib Dems in 2010, or
Yeah.
a confidence and supply agreement, as Theresa May had to do
With
when
the
she
DUP.
did have most of the seats, but not an outright majority, and she had to do that deal with the DUP.
And the Lib Dems, if you ask them about 2010, which they still find quite scarring, obviously, will say, you don't understand what the pressure was like. The Conservatives were the largest party. We were under pressure to do a deal with them as the largest party.
I suppose it brings us to another question of keeping things exciting and remembering what if everyone's wrong, what if everyone agrees that they're going to vote Labour and then no one does. So this brings us on to a question.
No one at all. Not one single vote in a single constituency.
So embarrassing.
It could happen, is all I'm saying. So we should come to Jamie Bamber's question. Now, I assume this is the Jamie Bamber who was in Battlestar Galactica.
I hope so.
Was
Captain
fantastic in
Adama.
it. Yeah. How much impact will newspaper endorsements and newer media outlets like GB News, never heard of them, have on this election campaign? The support of all the Tory papers seems to have helped the Conservatives in the past and made things very difficult for Labour. Will the same hold true this time? And why isn't the political influence of the Street of Shame discussed more as an issue? So, Adam, you were writing, I think, in the last issue of the magazine about the number of ex-advisors and ministers and people who, were all offering
Popping
their...
up to give us the benefit of their advice and say
Yeah.
where things had gone wrong for the Tories. It was when they employed you.
I know 14 years of people all backed up saying, well, actually,
Was it Nick
the
Timothy?
bit, the bit where I wasn't working was actually the bit where it all went wrong.
Yeah.
So, but this is sort of how much impact do newspaper endorsements have in general?
At this stage in things, I think very, very little. I think the work has already gone in over the years with newspapers in as far as they're going to sway people's opinions at all. And they would like to think, editors would certainly like to think they do a lot to sway people's opinions. I'm not sure that they do. I mean, any polling that's been done, even the sort of the Sun during the height of that Kelvin Mackenzie Thatcherite era, there was an enormous number of Sun readers who were still going out and dutifully voting Labour in every election. The Mail, I mean, we'll have a lot of people who are going over to Labour this time, however vitriolic they want to be about Keir Starmer in their leader columns. I mean, in terms of it was the Sun what won it, I think that a lot of that has always been a nonsense. We've said this before on the podcast, haven't we? But it was incredibly late in the '97 election that they came over. They came out for Blair.
It's the other way round, isn't it? It's more like the papers soften up if they see the polls are drifting in one direction. And I think you can already see that with some of the... I think it must be quite tough for the Tories in this election, not just because they're making a sort of series of gaffes, but also because I think the press is being unusually kind of disrespectful to them. And I think if you're a Conservative minister who's used to having, being treated with a certain level of cordiality and respect and things you say just ending up on page, even if it's page 2 of a paper, there has been I've been a bit bruised, I think, by
Really?
the lack of... Do you not think?
Well, I feel like I'm extremely unusual as someone in their 30s who reads editorial pages in print newspapers. They seem to be sticking very closely to Labour will be a disaster, so you vote to keep them out at all costs. Whereas we were talking, Adam, about the Telegraph now being quite reformist in its...
Well, the Telegraph
outlook.
has gone slightly bonkers. I mean, the Telegraph, like a lot of these papers, I think now people are looking to, the right-wing papers are looking to the election beyond this one, which is the one for the next leader of the Conservative Party, and which faction is going to take that. So I think there's an awful lot. I mean, it is not insignificant that the Telegraph have hired Suella Braverman as a columnist in the last couple of months, and that move towards very much the right wing of the party and the edge of the party that would be doing a deal with reform if certain people had their way.
So if papers do follow where they think the support is likely to go, why haven't we seen many more papers flipping over already? I mean, if Labour is about to get a thumping majority, if that is true...
I don't think it's about endorsements. I think it's about seriousness. And as somebody who spent the 2010s covering Labour from the perspective of left-leaning magazine, the thing that was always was that the idea, not they were quite a joke exactly, but that the Conservatives, you could take them seriously, and Labour was sort of a bit of a jobbing amateur outfit, or, the fact that they would make proposals and they would just not even be reported on as being worth being talked about. This default assumption that, Conservatives were careful with their money. It did always feel like you were writing into a kind of headwind of, well, obviously if the Conservatives say it must be legitimate, or subjects that the Conservatives care about are legitimate big issue subjects. And I think that's the bit that's kind of changed, is that Rachel Reeves is clearly being taken very seriously by the Sun and the Mail because, frankly, her economic policies are probably the ones that are going to be enacted by the end of the year. it's kind of indefinable, but it is a sense of just being a legitimate, serious party and being treated like grown-ups and with a level of sort of respect. The idea that if David Lammy says something, it's now interesting because he's prospectively going to be our foreign secretary, whereas before it was a bit like, who cares what Labour's shadow foreign secretary says? Like, they're miles away from power.
Okay, here's another election-y one from David Winter. May I be the 94th person, very nice, to wonder why all political parties, but especially the party of government, leave it until the election campaign to launch policies. So from the Conservative Party, we've had national service and repeat offenders evicted from social housing, driving licence points for fly tippers. So these are the big issues.
I actually really like that one. I'm really pro that one. I'm sorry.
As someone who's been fly tipped in the recent past.
See the state of Lewisham sometimes. Yeah.
They clearly have a sufficient majority in Parliament to pass these things without trouble, and yet the first time we hear about them is at election time. Are they just trying to sound fresh and new, or are they going after specific groups of voters, trying to pick them off?
It is the $94 million question, isn't it? As you've had 14 years, why haven't you done any of these things before? And it's something we in the last podcast, we talked about that washing up period and all of those bills that got dropped along the way. And it was very, I mean, there's not been a lot going on in this last Parliament in terms of actual legislation being pushed through. So, yeah.
The big problem for opposition parties and why they don't do this is that you get your policies, if they're any good, they get stolen. So what happened in March with the budget was Jeremy Hunt essentially hoofed Labour's non-dom clampdown and as a revenue-raising measure, which he then, not only he stole it off them because they'd obviously earmarked that to pay for some other stuff that was in their manifesto, but he also managed to use it to put into his tax cuts. So the thing is, if you suggest something that is absolutely brilliant, then why wouldn't the other side not do it? And you'll get no credit for it. And, you know, if you suggest something that is objectively a good idea but quite unpopular, like planning reform, then you're going to just get endless airtime from the other side about all the downsides of it, laundered in advance. And when you're the opposition, you don't get the chance to make the case, right? You've got a huge amount of clout when you're the government to dictate, again, the kind of conversation about stuff.
Yeah. Is that why you end up with serious conversations not being had? Is that because there's no good time? Like the social care thing, which really torpedoed Theresa May's campaign in 2017. She was at least setting out some kind of way of dealing with social care, and it involved tax, and it was incredibly unpopular. And as a result, sort of banjacks her whole thing. When do you have the conversation then about what we actually do about social care?
I would say that is your beloved favourite podcaster, George Osborne's fault. And that's because if you remember, he'd said that Labour are going to have a death tax, you know, and any kind of discussion of those kind of care issues, which are very unpopular, they get weaponised against the party that's aiming to bring them in, because they always have to propose at some point that people are going to have to pay for some of their care themselves, which is why the great tell of the national service idea that it's never going to happen and it's unworkable was we're going to have a royal commission, because a royal commission is what you do when you go, this is going to be very unpopular, we want everybody to dip their, you know, it's like the murder on the Orient Express, we want everybody to stab this one. Sorry if I've spoiled Murder on the Orient Express for some very late readers to that, but you know what I mean, like that's the point, is people always talk about why doesn't bipartisan stuff happen. Actually at low level quite a lot does,
right?
But the problem is that lots of those things are nettles that have to be grasped, and people want to make sure everybody is having the same allergic reaction.
And in answer to your question about timing, I would say that the timing for something as difficult as social care or NHS reform is when you've just got in and you've got a pretty significant majority and some goodwill. And that's probably the only chance that assuming it's Labour coming in those sorts of circumstances, we have of getting something like that sorted out. I mean, it's endlessly being kicked down. I mean, do you remember, it was one of Boris Johnson's oven-ready things, wasn't it? He was going to sort social care. We'd never heard another word about that other than Matt Hancock wearing a little green badge with care written on it. That was about as far as that one went.
And it's so wrapped up with the immigration question as well. You know, there was the specific visa arrangements for carers because they fall often under the salary cap for migration. So it's a really fraught piece of the migration puzzle about how are you going to bring in people who are on much lower wages than technically we claim that we want people to come in and work on in this country.
Right. I've just remembered my favourite policy announcement from the campaign, which was on the front page of the Daily Mail, which was Tories will close the murder loopholes. Who left the murder loopholes open for 14 years?
What are the murder loopholes?
It's actually on a Sunday.
I've been getting away with it all this time.
On a Sunday, it's not illegal. Amazing. I mean, it's such a loophole. Yeah. No, it was a sensible-ish suggestion about sentencing, actually, but it was very much dolled up as the Purge style thing. Andrew Ioannou writes, why does mainstream media continue to give people like Nigel Farage, Piers Morgan et al. A voice and valuable airtime Regardless of their politics, which are admittedly the polar opposite of mine, these people have nothing of value to say. And the mainstream media has no impartiality rules to abide by, in the case of these people, but continues to give them airtime.
I'm going to harsh his mellow here by saying that I went to look up YouGov popularity ratings, and Nigel Farage is the most popular politician in Britain.
Wow.
30% of people have a very a favourable view of him, and 98% of us know who he is.
Right.
So there is a reason that he is the most well-known figure in British politics, and unfortunately also the most popular. I mean, Rishi Sunak has got a net favourability of, I think, minus 46. Keir Starmer is thrilling along in like minus 3 or something like that. It's a sub minus 10. But Nigel Farage is obviously incredibly divisive, but quite a lot of people do like him, and even more people have heard of him.
It comes down, doesn't it, to the same reason that there's endless Harry and Meghan stories online. It gets the clicks. People look at this stuff.
But there are rules, aren't there, about which parties get the airtime on things like Question Time, and it's a bit more complicated than you might think, because it's related to who did better in the most recent, for example, local elections. But
UKIP always complicated that because they always did incredibly well in European elections. So in a way, you could say how lovely that we were giving more airtime to these undercovered elections. But yeah, that has been a consistent complaint of the fact that Nigel Farage got way more time than, say, the Greens or Plaid.
Do you mean in the specific
over the last decade?
Right. Okay.
The way it's often phrased is maybe the Green Party would be doing as well as Reform or UKIP if they'd had the sustained level of attention, which I think to some extent is true, but I think also misunderstands the way that Reform and UKIP have always been advanced by the right-wing papers as a way of sort of stiffening the sinews of the Conservative Party not to go squishy, which is not, there aren't really left-wing papers to kind of do the same with the Greens, although you do see it now. You know, The Guardian is very pro-Green at this election, and I think is using them and talking about them and being interested in them as a way of interrogating where they feel that Labour's left flank has kind of ebbed away and that there's been a takeover by the right of the party.
It's basically a mirror image of what the Telegraph is doing with Reform.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. If your interest is in stopping your party drifting towards the centre, then you talk up their rivals on the edge and be more interested in them and pay more attention to their policies.
We should also just point out that, the impartiality rules only apply to public service broadcasters. And those who are regulated by Ofcom.
Right.
So, your whatever Piers Morgan is calling his show online now, all of those other things, all of those YouTube channels run by newspapers, and you never mind the ballots presented by Harry Cole, which is being very heavily trailed in the sun and possibly not watched by quite so many people, or newspapers themselves, or us. We can do absolutely what we want.
Can we?
Yeah. We don't even talk about the election at all. We don't need to be here, Andy.
Here is a question about process from Nick Jones. I'm so disappointed with our electoral system not being proportional representation. What do you think would be the key election issues and approaches if we did? And how does that differ from what we can, in quotes, look forward to over the next few weeks?
I think that will be a case of being slightly careful about what you wish for in terms of coverage. Because if it was a PR election, I think everyone would be the Lib Dems. Everyone would be just coming up with things that they knew they would never have to enact by the time they got into power on slightly wilder and wackier policies.
Isn't that what the Conservatives are currently doing?
Well, yeah, they're kind of a bit demob happy, aren't they?
Claiming they'll close these murder loopholes.
But it gets me thinking back to those days of coalition government and the expectation of another coalition government in 2015 when David Cameron did crazy wacky things like going, we'll have a referendum on Europe, thinking, that's all right, we'll be in coalition with the Lib Dems again. They're never going to let that happen.
I think you'd hear a lot more from the radical right. I mean, if you think that Reform are getting covered a lot now, if you look across Europe, we are quite unusual in that our radical right, populist right party is not represented at seat level in the same way that reflects its vote share. So if you think about the fact that Italy's got a populist right prime minister, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, have done very well at the European elections. They've actually did all right in the German election specifically. France is now going to have an election, sneaking in an election, jealous of ours, in which what used to be the Front National is now called National Rally, are expected to do pretty well. So, if anything, it depends where you stand in your politics. Sound like our correspondence politics may not be those of Richard Tice. That actually we'd probably be hearing a lot more from the populist right if we had a proportional system.
Right.
And there would be more interest in deals between the parties as well. So you would almost certainly see the Conservatives kind of being more happy to move in that direction of reform and think in the expectation that they might end up doing a deal with them afterwards. I mean, that would be the obvious coalition, wouldn't it? If
Yeah,
they
there's
do
a
well.
lot of squeeze messages you'd get. Because if you remember 2015, you had any vote for Ed Miliband is actually a vote for the SNP to get loads of money for their Scottish hospitals and none for yours, which the Conservatives will tell you worked extremely effectively in England as a message that, they're just going to be more and more bungs to Scotland and nothing for us here. And that did really harm Labour.
What was that? Say that again. Only vote for the...
Basically, if you don't vote Conservative, end up with the Conservative government, you'll end up with the Labour SNP coalition. Do you remember those images of...
Chaos with Ed Miliband?
Yeah. Do you remember him in the pocket of Sturgeon and Salmond? That was the idea, that Labour can only govern with the SNP, so that what they're going to do is give them a load of money, which will be spent on Scottish public services, not on you. Ironic that we then 2 years later get to Theresa May handing out 11 billion to the DUP in order to get her budgets through.
Can we quickly digress into the election poster featuring someone in someone else's pocket thing?
Because it was a big thing for a few elections running, wasn't it?
Only a couple of days ago there is an advert of Keir Starmer as a glove puppet being controlled by Angela Rayner.
Not quite so effective when it's Angela Rayner, who is in the same party as Keir Starmer.
No, it's...
I mean, it probably is if you're really, really sexist, but you just don't think women should have
Well, no, I
any.
think that's exactly it, because the other figure that there is in every party, as well as the attack dog, there is the boo figure. And now for a long and this would be all Labour leaflets for a while in the Ed Miliband era would feature Michael Gove in them, because for Labour voters, the one person who really got the tills ringing, they were like, I bloody hate that Michael Gove. And for the flip side of that in the Corbyn era was Diane Abbott. Now you might say that these things, I think in her case racism and sexism were part of that there was a kind of fear of her like that, but there is one person who is seen to represent everything you hate about that party to the opposite side. Now, obviously, lots of Tories love Michael Gove, lots of people in Labour love Diane Abbott, but they were the negative polarising figures.
Interesting.
And Angela Rayner is now, for some Tories, because she's quite gobby and she's a woman, fulfilling that role.
And it's moved on, hasn't it? Because a long time it was, Keir Starmer served in Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet. He wanted to make Jeremy Corbyn, but he's so emphatically broken with the Jeremy Corbyn years that they have had to identify someone else, haven't they?
I just feel like it's one of those election-y things that if you work in politics, you recognise as a thing, and if you don't, it feels a bit weird and alien, and it's just...
But isn't that most of politics?
Well, it is. I mean, if you're listening to this show right now, and thank you, and please keep doing it, you're
weird.
You're weird. I mean, most people... There's this sort of awful stat that most people think about politics for 20 seconds a day, if that.
Well, the amount of space that the election campaign is getting in, for instance, The Sun, most of it on a very sort of technical, nerdy kind of level, and very un-Sun, not very fun sort of level.
Yeah.
You just think, how much of this are your readers actually bothering with? How much do they care?
It's a great time to announce the fact that this podcast will, of course, be going daily for the rest of the election.
God.
Not
God,
daily.
can you imagine?
In fact, hourly. We'll be doing this podcast. I'll be phoning up Adam when he's having his bath in the evening and going, got any thoughts on Ed Miliband?
Perma-crisis podcast.
You don't want to know what I think about Ed Miliband in the bath.
I think we should move on from our listener questions.
I think we really should.
And move on to something a bit jollier. Now we've got a couple of rival quizzes. So Adam, you've done a quiz, and I've bashed out a few questions as well.
So my quiz, I'm doing past elections as depicted in the eye. So join in at home with this one, listeners.
Brilliant. Here's me.
Can you present your weapons? That's handy.
And I will be doing this.
Ooh. So, the cover of I-920 showed John Major calling the election in 1997. It depicted him grinning broadly with a giggling Tony Blair. And in our version, Blair is saying, so it's May 1st. And Major replies, Mayday, 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 which I think is a joke we've used on several other occasions as well. But in that photo, what were they actually laughing about?
Is it something sports related?
It's not.
Okay.
Unless you count fishing as a sport.
Is it something fishing relating?
It is!
Is it about trout?
No.
Okay. Perch,
it's about John
pike.
Major's sunburnt goldfish. John Major was telling them that him and Norma had to fish all of their goldfish out of the pond in their garden and apply sun cream to them because they were getting sunburnt.
Wow.
You can't put SPF on a fish.
Well, but you think it would just...
It feels like it'll
waterproof.
play absolute haywire with their genes, I suspect. It'll...
Like the three-eyed fish in The Simpsons.
You'll get some blinkies, yeah.
The bit I'd forgotten was that this was then confirmed by a spokesman for the Prime Minister who said, the Prime Minister has a pond in his garden in which he takes a great interest. He has a number of other types, but the bulk of the population is goldfish.
Get him back. Get him back. We need this kind of statesmanship. That's great. That's okay.
I would like people to write in if they know what sun cream you put on fish, because that's great information that you could use.
I knew you wouldn't get it, but I knew you'd want to know once you'd heard what the answer was. So the 2001 election, we're moving on a few years, Tony Blair called it at a venue that had certain resonance for private eye readers, as pointed out by an incredulous Jeremy Paxman when he interviewed him on Newsnight a few days later. Why so?
Certain resonance
for private eye readers.
The Coach and Horses pub in Soho.
He did not go to our local pub to do it, although that would have been rather brilliant. Helen?
Was it like the Ugandan embassy?
Not that resonant for eye readers.
Neasden. Somewhere in Neasden.
You were just going through all of
Yeah.
the possible. No, he did it at a lectern in front of a stained glass window, not actually in a church. But as Paxman pointed out to him a few days later, how soon did you realise it was a mistake? Come on! Seriously, there must have been a point there where you were in front of the stained glass window and you thought, I'm the Vicar of St Albans.
Very nice.
Which was, of course, for younger readers, our spoof prime ministerial newsletter that we ran for many years. Blair not happy about this. Blair very, very stroppy. He said, I'll tell you what I thought. I hope people would pay attention to what I was saying. That was naive.
I'm quite sure that we got both your John Major and your Tony Blair impression so far today.
It's been a whirlwind.
So, final question. 2 members of the Eye's editorial team, but neither of them, sadly, still with us, have stood for election themselves, both against the leaders of major parties. Who and what were their slogans? Oh, that was a kind of joint thing. Do you want to? Do you want to have one, Andy?
I'll have first crack. Willie Rushton ran in 1964 against Alec Douglas Hume with the slogan "Death to the Tories."
You're 1 year out, in the words of the great Ken Bruce.
Sorry,
it was 1963. It was the by-election which took Alec Douglas Hume out of the House of Lords, giving up his peerage, and back into the House of Commons in the safe seat of Kinross and West Perthshire. Because Harold Macmillan had basically said, yeah, no, you should be Prime Minister now, I'm off, because that's how it used to work in those days. 1963, Willie Rushton, Death to the Tories. Helen, do you want to go for the other one?
Did Paul Foote run, but not against the Prime Minister?
He didn't run against the Prime Minister, and he didn't run with a sort of private eye imprimatur. It's one of my favourite stories from the 70s. Ruff, ruff.
The dog.
Andrew thought,
Brink of the dog.
Auburn, I've got it. Auburn War ran against Jeremy Thorpe in his constituency for the Dog Lovers Party.
He did indeed. Under the slogan, a better deal for your dog. The deal in question being that it's probably not going to get shot in the head in an attempted murder on your ex-boyfriend.
Wow.
Do you want to know how many votes he got?
Yes.
79.
Is that better than Willie Rushton got?
45.
I thought more people like dogs than that. I would have thought running on the dog... I mean, just as a general... Like, if there was a dog lovers party, I reckon it would consistently pull 3 or 4%.
Andy, you are victorious.
Thanks
and you
very
get
much.
to do your own quiz as a prize.
Well, this is just a Quizlet. This is just a sort of follow-up on... And this is on the current election, so it's just based on bits of the campaign that you might not have seen yet.
Ceremonially hand over the bell.
So, yeah. There we go. Okay. Are these following categories of potential voter real or not?
Ooh.
Okay. And this is actually this election and previous ones. Right. Waitrose woman.
Real.
She's real.
Yeah.
Point to you. Motorway man.
Not real.
Not real.
Motorway man is real.
Is he? I
He
thought-
was cited a few
Mondeo man.
a few elections ago. Mondeo man was also real.
He's 97, isn't he?
And he would have driven along a motorway, I suppose, at some point. Sadly, the Mondeo was phased out in 2022 because Ford's going all electric. Not sadly, actually. I'm very happy about it. Anyway, Basildon man.
He's real. He's 1992.
That's another point. That's another point to Adam. EastEnders woman.
That was
Helen.
a very sad honk. I don't think that is real.
Bingo. She's not real. There was a Holby City woman. But EastEnders woman, as far as I can tell, has never been made up
What
by
was
a
Holby
newspaper or a
City
party.
woman?
She was...
Was she really in Cardiff, but
she was in-
pretending to be somewhere else?
I think she was the sort of woman who would have watched Holby City. So she was in her 30s or 40s. She worked in clinical or clerical work, and she was a key demographic a few
That's
elections
Worcester
ago.
woman, like rebadged. Much
There we
like
go.
many of the cars involved. She simply had a new skin put on. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think Adam was a couple ahead there, so I'm going to give Adam 2 points.
Woohoo.
Okay, and one more now, quickfire. This is who commands leads in these specifically polled sectors of the British society? Okay, which party? So, for example, Waitrose. Helen.
Labour.
No,
Is it
I'm afraid
green?
not. It's the Conservatives. Waitrose is the only supermarket where the
fascinating.
Conservatives have a lead. It's only a lead of 1.2%. And 5 years ago, they had a lead of 36%. So
Does Waitrose have a vote?
Waitrose is a marginal constituency.
in a sense. Interestingly, which party is doing best in the co-op? Adam.
The Labour and Cooperative Party, presumably.
No, it's Reform. What? I know. That's the place where Reform are doing best. Sorry.
In the co-op.
Reform are not among co-op
Specifically
shoppers.
bread aisle or frozen aisle? Or...
I see, you've lied to us. Actually, Labour presumably were doing best overall among co-op people. It's just, of all the supermarkets,
Yeah.
co-op buyers are most likely to be Reform.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I retract that question and that point if I ever gave one out.
We
And
should
that was
deduct one from Adam for engaging with it.
GB News viewers. Which party has a lead there? Adam.
Must be Reform.
No, it's Labour.
What? No, it's not. That's, again, another point off him, I think.
I'm going into minus figures now. This is I'm the Rishi Sunak of this election.
It is a sign about. I mean, I assume the answer to all of these was going to be Labour because Labour's leads are just monstrous among absolutely everyone apart from the over 75s. But yeah, even GB News
That
has
kind of
fallen.
proves my point I was making earlier, doesn't it, about how little effect that the media actually have. If GB News viewers are coming away from that and thinking, oh, Labour, they look good, then
Yeah,
wow.
I love wokery. And
An hour of Jacob Rees-Mogg every night.
Cancel
suddenly,
Christmas.
Suddenly you're pro-Diane Abbott.
All right, final segment of society. Farmers. Helen.
Labour.
Well, this is according to the Farmers Guardian, and it's only based on a poll of about 150 farmers, but the Conservatives have a very narrow lead among farmers. Yeah. And I think, edging that by about 1 point, was Adam.
Oh, hurrah!
Just so you know, yeah. Right.
I am prepared to enter coalition talks with Helen, so we'll sort something out.
Great. Well, we'll be back in 2 weeks when the polls have tightened and everything has changed all over again, or when they haven't and it hasn't. So we look forward to seeing you then. As always, please do get a copy of the magazine. In fact, do as Jason Borthwick does and get a subscription yourself. This episode, as always, was produced by Matt Hill of Rethink Audio. We'll be back in a fortnight, as I say, with another one. We'll see you then. Goodbye.